Israel's initiation of an aerial war against Iran has complicated the geopolitical situation. Never mind what might happen if the United States soon intervenes to target Iran's well-protected nuclear installations. You guys had a bunch of questions about what is happening, particularly in regard to the Strait of Hormuz, and the spillover effects in Russia, Ukraine, and even Syria. Well, today, I'm going to answer a few of those questions. I am prioritizing depth of answers rather than answering as many questions as possible. So if you want to skip ahead, be sure to use the chapters function. Now let's get to it. What effect do you think closing the Strait of Hormuz would have on the lines on maps? Well, it would have a gigantic impact. The primary thing that it would be doing here is to increase the costs of war to the United States to a substantial degree. If you think about the options available to Tehran to try to impose costs on the United States, there really aren't that many. In the event of such an intervention from the United States, obviously Iran is going to try to shoot down the planes that the United States is flying. But given all of the damage that Israel has done to that infrastructure, that's a tough ask. So you might as well remove that, cross that off of the list of possible costs that Iran is going to be able to impose, at least on a large scale. Maybe Iran will be able to shoot down a plane or two, who knows, we will see. But Iran can't be focusing on that as the main imposition of costs against the United States. Well, then what's left for Iran? Primarily, you have two things that are going to be discussed. One is attacking U.S. bases in the region, and there are a lot of those. And two is to try to attack the U.S. homeland. Let's start with the U.S. homeland part. That's going to be a long-run effect. That's something that Iran might be able to plan, having seen a couple of recent attacks, one with Israel on Iran, the other with Ukraine on Russia, with smuggling drones into the area and having those relatively low-tech drones be able to inflict massive damage on sensitive targets. And that's something I'll talk about on the main channel in a week or two, but it's still not a great option for Iran because that's a long-run effect. You're not going to be able to immediately impose costs on the United States by doing that. It's going to take time to plan that, and unless Iran has been working on this for months now prior to any sort of current flare-up, Iran is not going to be able to rapidly deploy that kind of attack. Well, that leaves attacking U.S. bases in the region. And again, there are a lot of those, but there's a problem with how U.S. citizens, the people that can have political change or affect political change in the United States, are going to interpret any sort of attacks on those bases. To be blunt, that is something that the average American citizen is not going to internalize. Of course, there are going to be people on those particular bases who may actually be injured or worse, and that's going to be bad for them. It's going to be bad for their friends and their family, but all told, that's not very many individuals, and not enough to be able to affect political change in Washington. There's just such a disconnect there because they are so far away. And as a quick sanity check there, you may or may not remember that during the first Trump administration, the United States assassinated an Iranian general, and in retaliation for that, Iran attacked a U.S. base. If you remember that, that's great, but it's probably a fleeting memory at this point, and if you've completely forgotten about it, well, again, that's sort of the point. It's not the type of thing that gets fully internalized by U.S. citizens, unless it is directly affecting U.S. citizens. So it might hurt those that were impacted by the attack that happened during the first Trump administration, or alternatively, thinking about the future, anyone who has a service member stationed abroad in one of those areas that could be under attack, they are going to be very concerned about that. But that's a relatively small portion of the population, and certainly not one that is large enough to have enough political sway to convince individuals inside of Washington to do things differently. The Strait of Hormuz, on the other hand, is a completely different story. As soon as the strait gets shut down, and we'll just assume for a moment that it works, that Iran is capable of doing that. Hold that thought for perhaps later on today. Assuming that it gets shut down, what will happen immediately thereafter is a spike in prices of gasoline, energy, oil, whatever you want to think about, all the stuff that's coming through there. Every single one of those items is going to have a spike in prices. And as you know, if you have a spike in oil prices, that's not the end of it. It's not just that U.S. consumers going to the gas pumps are going to see the number going higher and be able to immediately associate and connect that to the Strait of Hormuz, because that will be the single thing that's on the news all day, every day, for a long time period afterward. Yes, U.S. consumers are going to understand that, but that's just the beginning of it. because there are so many products that require oil and gas as an input good to produce the output good. If the price of oil and gas is going up, then the price of all those inputs goes up, which means the output good, anything that is being produced using those sorts of goods, those are going to go up in price as well. And you're going to see an inflationary spike, broadly speaking, along the US economy. Put all of that together, and what do you get? A whole bunch of very upset US consumers who might start looking to take this out on politicians. Clearly, this is going to start at the top with the White House, given that the White House, the president, is the chief executive, and so he is the one that is choosing whether to start wars or not. He is responsible fundamentally for this hypothetical shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz through the actions of attacking Iran. That is going to result in anger at the White House, but you'll see that more manifested perhaps in how the US citizens are dealing with their congressional representatives and senators. There are going to be lots of discussions toward those senators and toward those members of Congress to start taking actions that are going to shut down, not the Strait of Hormuz here, but shut down the president's ability to continue this war and apply political pressure through that mechanism. So the subgame then becomes for the Trump administration, how quickly can the US military force the Strait of Hormuz to reopen? And that's complicated because you have to convince individuals to go through the Strait of Hormuz, and there may be lots of military protection of ships that are going through, so you get these nice convoys to try to reduce the amount of damage or risks that the convoy could face as it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. But that's going to be the subgame. And the question is, how effective will the US military be at accomplishing that goal of allowing for safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, even though Iran is trying to stop that, versus how angry and how quickly the anger gets growing inside of the United States to apply political pressure to the White House to change the policy over there in Iran. To be clear, none of this would necessarily be a very good idea for Iran to do. Obviously, Iran is threatening this sort of thing, but Iran benefits from having the Strait of Hormuz open as well, because Iran would also like to get a lot of its products through there. Iran has tried to take some preliminary steps to mitigate the concern, but it's not fully there, and Iran will therefore be hurting itself by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. But the question remains, would everyone else be harmed even more? And aside from that, would Iran get into a position where it is so desperate that it is willing to try something that it might very well find to be very painful, but it's worth the risk because something has to change, because the alternative is that Iran loses the war? Continuing on this topic, can Iran still cut off the Strait of Hormuz from the land if its naval power becomes neutralized? Well, yes, I think the answer is pretty clear there, and it doesn't require much speculation, because all we really need to do is look to the other side of the peninsula for a direct answer. Remember, that is the location of the Yemeni Houthi rebels, and with a combination of some somewhat sophisticated technology and a whole lot of relatively unsophisticated technology, have wreaked havoc on shipping lanes at the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is at the end of the Red Sea, and thus a part of the journey going through the Suez Canal from Europe over to Asia. The key thing to keep in mind here is that the Houthis never needed sophisticated technology to cause a squeeze along the Bab. All they really needed was to be able to fire some drones in the general direction of the shipping vessels going through there, or using relatively basic boats to have pirates get aboard those ships and commandeer them. I'm not talking about the level of sophistication of US naval vessels. I'm not even talking about the relatively low sophistication of Iranian naval vessels. I'm talking about basic boats. That is the type of thing that you can use to cause all sorts of havoc in the area. And if you throw in just a little bit of okay military technology, say a military helicopter, then it's going to be all the worse. And we actually saw that with the initial hijacking in the Bab el-Mandab Strait when the Galaxy Leader was captured by the Houthis. They used a military helicopter there. Moving back east and back to the Strait of Hormuz, as this question is hinting at, if Iran ever did try to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, what we would see in short order is just how powerful the US Navy is compared to a second-rate Navy like Iran. Iran does not stand a chance in that naval battle. That is something we can be relatively confident about. The story will probably look very similar for all of the traditional military installations along the strait that Iran might want to use to cause havoc there. So thinking about ballistic missile installations or just standard sort of cruise missile installations, whatever you want.
All of those things can be found relatively easily, and goodness knows Israel has probably destroyed most of them already. If you have the United States getting involved too, the United States has that same sort of capacity that Israel has, but also has a lot more stores of missiles to be able to fire at those installations and destroy them as well. So presumably, when you have the strait shut down, it is not going to be in the long run as a consequence of what's going on with traditional navies or traditional sorts of missiles or other sorts of weapons that could be placed on land and fired through conventional means. Where the problems will begin to arise is when Iran abandons the traditional sorts of conventional military technologies and instead starts to duplicate the Houthi strategy. Because we know that the Houthi strategy is effective. It's been tested. And after a long period of time, more than a month of the United States trying to undo whatever the Houthis had in terms of capacity, the United States failed to do it. Because it's hard when you have quadcopters and drones and other sorts of small-scale military technologies that are firing at ships. It's hard for the United States to be able to find all of that sort of stuff. Easy when we're talking about installations. Hard when we're talking about things that don't necessarily show up on the satellites. That means the White House is going to be fighting an uphill battle. It could be the case that, militarily speaking, you have won the order of the day, so to speak. You don't have any rivals that are fighting you in terms of ship-to-ship combat, or even surface missiles on land firing at U.S. naval ships, or at any sort of commerce that's coming through the area. Even if you can declare victory in that regard, you still have to convince the businesses to actually go through the area. It's not like the White House or any other capital is going to be able to force those businesses to run through the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, there are policies that the governments can put into place to encourage those businesses to go through. So you might imagine the Saudi government or the Kuwaiti government or the Iraqi government or even the US government saying, look, we know that it's difficult for you to get insurance because insurance companies don't like the idea of one of these very expensive tankers getting destroyed. We'll directly insure you. If there is a problem, if your ship gets destroyed, we will pay for the damages. We will cover that for you. And that may in fact work, but at the same time, we have had a long period of time where the Houthis have not been able to damage any vessels going through the Bab el-Mandab Strait, and despite that, we're still not seeing the level of ship passages on a daily basis back to the levels that they were before all of this mess began. It's probably worth pointing out, though, that the Persian Gulf is a bit of a different animal. If you don't want to go through the Bab el-Mandab Strait, there is an alternative. It's expensive, but it's readily feasible. You just sail all the way around Africa instead of cutting through the Bab el-Mandab Strait and then the Suez Canal. It's something you can do, you just have to pay more for the shipping to go that extra distance. With the Persian Gulf, there isn't really an alternative. There aren't the level of pipelines that you would need to be able to say, hey, instead of having all of this stuff go through the Persian Gulf, why don't we send it through the Red Sea instead? That just isn't available. And so if you have ships that have oil on them, there may only really be one way to get it out, which is to go through the Strait of Hormuz. And so you might still see the same level of ships going through the Strait of Hormuz once the conventional military battle is completed. That said, this is not going to completely solve that inflation problem, because there will be decisions made about starting new oil wells under these circumstances that are not going to be profitable when you have higher shipping costs, because that higher shipping cost is not going to be going away. You're still going to have that even if the strait is open and even if traffic is at relatively normal levels. So, to conclude here, can Iran still cut off the Strait of Hormuz from the land if its naval power becomes neutralized? Yes, absolutely. What happens next, though, is going to be something that is a bit of a puzzle and is going to have a major effect, again, conditional on the strait being shut down, on whether that strategy is effective or not. Bold of you to assume Trump isn't around after 2028. I know that this isn't a question, but things like this pop up in the comments section all the time, and we really got to address it. This happens once every video. This is going to be the rant of the day. Here's my message to all of you who feel this way. If you really do believe that this is the case, boy, do I have a money-making opportunity for you. And bear in mind that nothing on this channel should be construed as financial advice. I'm just telling you about what exists out there in the world. And you shouldn't do this, because it would be a bad idea. But here goes. We've talked before in the most recent video about what the odds are of various things happening with Iran. and I was getting data from what's called Polymarket, which is essentially an online betting platform where you can bet on political events like, will the United States attack Iran? Will the Strait of Hormuz be shut down? And will the Ayatollah fall from power by the end of the month? Now, just as a fun little experiment, and again, this is not advice, what I want you to do now is just think to yourself, what are the odds that Donald Trump, not Donald Trump Jr., mind you, but the current president, Donald J. Trump, what are the odds that he is the Republican nominee for president in 2028? I'm not even talking about Donald Trump winning the election in 2028 in November. I'm purely talking about him being the Republican nominee. Think about that for a second. Write it down. Perhaps put it in the comments. What is the likelihood that Donald J. Trump will be the Republican nominee next time? Well, like I said, there is a betting market out there on the internet, on Polymarket. And the odds on that betting market right now are 8%. 8%. And again, that's not to be the president in 2029. That is simply to win the Republican nomination. So for anyone out there who thinks the odds of that are 100%, guess what? Huge money-making opportunity over on those betting markets. If you put in $1, you are going to get whatever 100 divided by 8 is. Oh gosh, off the top of my head, let's see. 10, 12 and a half. You'll get a 12 and a half times return on that. 12 and a half times return. And yeah, you'll have to put in the money right now, and you'll have to wait a few years for it to actually pay off. But you will never, ever, ever encounter a better return on your dollars than that. This will be the best investment that you will ever make. With, again, the caveat here that this is not investment advice, because that would be a really bad idea for you to do. This is not something that you should do. So my point here is that the people that are actually willing to put skin in the game, who actually are having money on the line about this sort of question, they don't think that this is particularly likely. I suppose having even an 8% chance of something unconstitutional happening is still pretty bad. This is not a normative comment about that. This is just me pointing out that the likelihood of this happening from the perspective of people that are willing to actually bet money on it is that it is very unlikely to happen. And I think it is worth spending a moment now to discuss why that is unlikely to be the case. And I'm going to gear my argument toward people who would post things like, bold of you to assume Trump isn't around after 2028. Because what we could be doing right now is spending a moment describing just how difficult it would be to actually try to change the Constitution for Donald Trump to run through constitutional means for a third term. And I could also point out how easy of a Supreme Court case it would be if there isn't a change to the Constitution and President Trump tries to have a third term in office. And yeah, sure, I know that the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative supermajority there. That's hard to say. Conservative supermajority. There's a 6-3 conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court. But even despite that, that supermajority has not held under various cases of less importance that have been brought to the Supreme Court to challenge the Trump administration. So if the Supreme Court is not siding with the Trump administration on the small peanuts, you can imagine how they would feel about something that is trying to change the fundamental system of power that the United States has. I want to focus the bulk of the argument on the idea that Donald Trump just wants to maintain power for as long as he possibly can. Well, that being the case, even if there is some sort of way that he thinks he might be able to have a fighting chance in front of the Supreme Court, that's probably not the best way of doing it. At the end of the current term in office, Donald Trump will be 83 years old. And while he avoids alcohol and other drugs, at least so he claims, being 83 years old and being in the shape that he is in, I gotta say, Donald Trump isn't working out on a daily basis. So being 83 years old and having that sort of health, you're probably not long for this world. And the trouble for this pathological Trump that we're assuming here is that we do not live in a monarchy. If Donald Trump dies, it is not the case that Donald Trump's heir is going to be the next person who becomes president of the United States. Donald Trump Jr. will not become president when Donald Trump Sr. dies. No, it goes to the vice president of the United States, whomever that may be. So if you are Donald Trump, and either you are a true believer in the MAGA movement, or alternatively, you're really just in this for yourself and for your family and increasing the Trump wealth over the long run, what are you going to do? Well, if it's about MAGA, if you're a true believer, you are going to make sure that whoever is the vice president of the United States is going to be able to continue that same sort of political philosophy and be able to watch over it and keep that movement going well after you have passed away. Meanwhile, if it's the bloodline that you're focused on, you're probably not going to be putting your eggs in the Eric basket. It's going to be either Donald Trump Jr. or maybe Ivanka Trump. Either way, what you would want to be doing under this circumstance is focusing on getting some sort of transfer of power from you to them. And it will be really difficult for you to be a kingmaker in that regard unless you start doing that work now, which means, again, because this is the path of least resistance, getting that political power transferred to them currently so that they have a platform to run on for the 2028 election. Now, it is worth noting that the betting market odds for Ivanka or Donald Trump Jr. aren't looking very good either. The overall point here, though, is that having a third term is probably not a really good way to maximize the long-run power that your name has and your movement has. And that's a good reason why, on the betting markets, President Trump is only an 8% chance to win the Republican nomination in 2028, never mind become the president for a third term.
Greetings from the future. I am still William Spaniel, and as I was editing this video, it occurred to me I could just ask you guys what you think the likelihood is that Trump is the nominee for the Republican Party in 2028. And after 16 minutes, I've already accumulated 1,000 votes. The majority of you have it at less than 10%, which is consistent with the betting market. That's good, but there is a quarter of you who are above 30%. Interesting, but again, not investment advice. I don't think you should go ahead and bet on that. It is just something that is out there and it is interesting to look at.
Questions to be asked. How much did the fall of Assad play into the Israeli strikes against Iranian nuclear sites? What do we know about the Iranian regime running to Moscow, if anything? Thank you for the content. Well, thank you for watching and listening to the content. Let me start off with what's going on about Assad and Syria. The answer there is that this probably did have a significant impact, and we can know that by purely looking at Israel's pathway toward bombing Iran. Let me just situate ourselves geographically for a moment. If you want to fly from Israel to Iran, and you do not want to go through Saudi airspace, the easiest way of doing that would be to fly north, first go through Syria, then go through Iraq, and then enter Iran. So again, going from west to east, it is Israel, Syria, Iraq, Iran. I'll get back to Syria in a second, but first, there's something worth noting that's interesting about what's happening with Iraq. When Israel is flying through Iraq, Israel is sticking to the northern part of that country. And if you think for a second about why that's the case, you'll probably come up with the correct answer. The northern part of Iraq is Kurdish Iraq. And if you know anything about the geopolitics of the region, it's that there are Kurds over in Iran as well, not to mention the Kurds in Iraq as well as the Kurds in Turkey. There's a bunch of Kurds all in that region. Kurds don't actually have a full-on state, and certainly the Kurds in northern Iraq don't really like what's happening in Iran. And I'm not talking about the Israeli bombing of Iran, I'm talking about the government of Iran and how Kurds are treated inside of Iran. As a result, when Iraqi Kurds see Israeli planes flying overhead, what they're probably thinking to themselves is something along the lines of, oh no. Anyway, and then they just move on with their day. It's no skin off of their back. Israel, of course, has known that that would be the case all along. That's nothing new. The problem with using northern Iraqi airspace to fly into Iran is that to get into northern Iran, you would first have to fly through Syria. And up until 6 months ago, that was a really difficult challenge. Actually, if we zoom out a second, none of Israel's motives here are new. It has been the case for now more than 2 decades that Israel has had an interest in perhaps bombing Iranian nuclear facilities. But what has always been a question mark, and I'm talking about going back to the early 2010s, this was a topic of conversation. The question was always, how does Israel get all the way over to Iran? It was much easier back in the day to bomb a sole location, a single facility inside of Syria. That's because, Israel and Syria, they border each other, so it's not a very long flight. And sure, you have to be concerned about interceptions while you're over Syria, but it's not going to last long, and you're not going to be undertaking sustained operations to do this. Similarly, over with Iraq in the early 1980s, 1981 in Operation Opera. With that, it was a single one-shot opportunity to pretend like you are lost individuals from Jordan that have ventured over into Saudi airspace to get yourself all the way over to Iraq and bomb Iraq and come back. That itself was still relatively easy to do as compared to flying all the way to Iran and, moreover, having sustained operations in Iran. So, as a result of this, I can remember a serious conversation that was probably around the early 2010s, where people were asking, well, okay, Israel and Iran are very far away from each other. Azerbaijan and Iran are right next to each other. Would Azerbaijan be okay partnering with Israel to blow up Iranian nuclear facilities? Either having Israeli jets be stationed out of Azerbaijan, or perhaps Israeli jets starting in Israel and then flying to Iran to drop their payloads on the Iranian facilities. And then because Israel does not have enough fuel to get all the way back to Israel, maybe they just land in Azerbaijan and somehow figure out a way home later. And if that feels like a bit much to you, that's because it is a bit much. What has made this so much easier is that in the last 6 months, what have we seen? We've seen the fall of the Assad government, and we have a new regime in place inside of Syria. Moreover, in the time when Syria was in the midst of the chaos of the end of the Syrian civil war, Israel recognized that there was an opportunity to go into Syria and bomb a lot of materiel, the same type of materiel that might be used later to target Israeli planes flying over Syrian airspace. If you get rid of those interceptors over Syria, suddenly Israel does not have to be particularly concerned no matter what government ultimately installs itself inside of the capital of Syria. Doesn't matter who the government is, if they don't have the capacity to shoot down planes, they're not going to shoot down planes. So yes, the fall of Assad played a big role in the Israeli strikes, purely because we would not be seeing the strikes in the manner that they are being conducted if there hadn't been that chaos in December with the Syrian government and the civil war falling apart just like that. Now, maybe if the Assad government is still around, Israel still tries some sort of operation against Iran, but there are going to be more steps to having a successful operation under those circumstances. So we probably would not be seeing the same level of Israeli successes as we have today over the first few days of combat. You might see a pre-combat phase where you're, instead of fighting Iran, fighting proxies in Syria and intervening in the Syrian civil war in a way that was more heavy than Israel had previously done. But that, of course, wraps up into complications with the fact that Russia was involved in the Syrian civil war, and that opens up a larger Pandora's box, or maybe a series of dominoes, if you will, that none of this happens without Russia invading Ukraine, because it was Russia being distracted with the invasion of Ukraine that prevented Russia from being able to exert extra force and extra pressure and power inside of Syria to prop up the Syrian government when it looked like that the Syrian government was on its last legs. Well, that part of the answer took a long time, so it's a good thing that with the second question, what do we know about the Iranian regime running to Moscow, if anything? That answer is going to be relatively short. Obviously, there is some additional pressure against the Ayatollah. There is further on the betting markets some relatively good chances that the Ayatollah would be stepping down. I think we're still a good distance away from having that be a serious conversation to have. We will see what happens if the United States engages in Iran. That could rapidly change if the United States does. But obviously, if the Ayatollah were to want to step down from power, the obvious place to leave the country of Iran and go elsewhere would be to go to Iran, or rather to go to Russia, and probably meet up with Assad, who's there, as well as Viktor Yanukovych from the earlier phase of all of this madness that's happening with those dominoes from earlier, and the evacuation of Yanukovych from Ukraine at the start of Ukraine's troubles back in 2014. Question. Even if we assume Ukraine has a 3-to-1 ratio against Russia, that's referring to casualties, Russia's population is around 140 million, and Ukraine's is about 35 million. Wouldn't Ukraine still hit a manpower breaking point first, resulting in an inevitable collapse of the current lines on maps? I think this is one of the bigger misconceptions about the war, and oftentimes what wars of attrition look like more generally. This war is not attritional in the sense of, we are fighting and we're going to keep fighting until there is literally no one left. That type of war of attrition is relatively rare. Instead, the types of wars of attrition that you see perhaps would be better described as political attritional wars. What I mean by that is that you have two parties, each raising an army, and then meeting out on a battlefield and really trying to shoot and kill each other, instead of having those two armies engage in maneuver warfare, where they are trying to outposition the other side, and rather than engaging in direct combat, they are just trying to win over the territory by putting the other side in an unsustainable position and either forcing surrender or forcing retreat. But critically, and again, what they are doing in these political attritional wars is not firing at each other until the other side's line has been completely evaporated. And then because you still have 10 men left over and they're down to 0, you take over the next trench, and then you take over the next trench, and then you take over the next trench, and so forth. That is not what goes on in the more traditional war of attrition. And I know that that phrase still conjures up the "we are fighting to the last man to win." That is not the most common type of war of attrition. Again, the most common type of war of attrition are these political attritional battles, where you are trying to convince the other side through the destruction of their men and of their property and of all of that good stuff that they would want to have under peacetime. You are trying to convince politically the other side to give up. Obviously, this is, at the end of the day, a military battle still, and the better military is going to be advantaged in that process, as well as the side that has more men fighting, because if you have more men fighting, it's going to be easier for you to shoot the other side. If I have 5 people shooting at one guy, I'm going to be winning more often than the vice versa situation where I have one guy on my side and 5 people shooting at my guy. But the other half of it is political. How much do I value the stakes versus how much do you value the stakes? Because, yeah, we're both losing men. We're both having property be destroyed. That's bad for both of us. But if I care more about the issues, I'm going to politically sustain myself for a longer period of time than you are. And even if it's the case that if we did play this out all the way to the bitter end, that I would end up losing out, I would not have enough men to continue, all of my men would be dead, you would still have some men left over, and indeed, as the question is asking, you would be able to inevitably collapse the current lines and take over my entire country. Even if that is the case, you have to politically survive long enough to reach that case. And when it turns out, when you can impose maybe 1 million casualties on the other side, as there are now some estimates that Ukraine has inflicted on Russia, bear in mind that casualties are not fatalities. This is a combination of fatalities, injuries, captured prisoners of war, missing, and so forth. If you have inflicted 1 million casualties on the other side, that's going to start raising political questions even from a more militarily capable country. It is the same reason why the United States could fight a war in Vietnam, and at the end of all of the fighting, the United States could not guarantee that South Vietnam would still exist. It is the same reason why the United States could spend literal decades fighting in Afghanistan and be much, much more powerful than the insurgency, and I guess originally the government that it was fighting. The United States could be a lot more powerful and still end up losing because the United States does not have the political will to continue the battle. And in contrast, the people on that particular soil, North Vietnam in one case, the Taliban in another case, and I guess supposing now we're trying to apply this to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Ukraine in that case, because Ukraine is fighting for its own land, whereas Russia is trying to conquer new land. If you have higher resolve than the more powerful foe, you can still end up winning. Of course, just because you have greater resolve doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win, so this isn't an obvious guaranteed victory from Ukraine at this point. It just gives Ukraine an advantage on that front. The trade-off, of course, is that Russia is more militarily powerful than Ukraine, and so that is why Russia has been able to continually press Ukraine for more than a year now and slowly advance that line on the map. The upshot for Ukraine is that Ukraine still has a ton of warm bodies. So this is very far away from that traditional sort of war of attrition, where Ukraine needs to be worried about the body count. That's not the concern. That's not the issue for Ukraine. The issue for Ukraine is leveraging the naturally higher resolve that Ukraine has to get more of those warm bodies who are still plentiful enough, maybe not plentiful in an aggregate sense, because Ukraine, like all those other countries in Eastern Europe, are having a horrible time when it comes to birth rates. There's still enough of them, though. The trick is leveraging your resolve to get them out onto the battlefield. And that has become more and more difficult over time, especially as Ukraine is seeing this grinding offensive coming from Russia. People in Ukraine are seeing what is happening along the Eastern Front and thinking to themselves, ooh, I don't think I want to be an infantryman. Even if I am more resolved about what's happening here, even if I care more about this than the average Russian soldier, I really don't like the looks of that, and I don't want to get myself involved in the situation. The other side of the equation is what's happening with Russia, and it's not looking good for Russia either. Consequently, the solution that Russia has to try to implement to solve that problem is to raise wages for recruited soldiers even higher. But that has the well-known side effect of increasing inflation in the country, which is its own political problem. And I keep using that word political for good reason. It is, again, because this is a political attritional battle. And for Ukraine, if there are political problems associated with inflation, then causing casualties to Russian soldiers in Ukraine has the political benefit of squeezing the Kremlin just a little bit more. Summing everything up, Ukraine really should not be worried about the pure attritional aspect of this war right now. Maybe that's the type of thing that we might have to revisit come 2027 or so, and maybe even longer into that. I don't know. That assumes that the war is still ongoing, and maybe we can have a conversation at that point about it. But that is a long time in the future. Instead, what Ukraine really should be more concerned about is making maneuver mistakes, allowing Russia to outflank and outstrategize Ukraine on the battlefield, allowing Russia to rapidly take large swaths of land without Ukraine being able to inflict the level of casualties that they currently are on Russia. It is okay in these political attritional battles to concede land. It is not okay in these political attritional battles to concede land without imposing significant costs to the other side. A few YouTube channels point out that, even while Russia assembles the improved Shaheds itself, some parts are still sourced from Iran. How true is that? This is referencing the video I had at the beginning of the week that was investigating how the war between Israel and Iran was going to affect the war between Russia and Ukraine. Broadly speaking, the point that I was trying to make there is that Russia fires a lot of Shahed-style drones at Ukraine. And once upon a time, Russia was importing those drones for sure, without any sort of doubt. Russia was getting those drones from Iran and then firing the Iranian drones from Russia into Ukraine. However, over the last year or so, there has been an effort made by Russia to domestically manufacture the Shahed drones. In other words, Iran has now sold a license to Russia, where Russia, in exchange for some payment, is able to build its own Shaheds on Russian soil and then fire those Russian-made Shaheds onto Ukraine. Now, with that as a preface, we can get back to this question. Is it the case, perhaps, that Russia is assembling all of the drones on Russian soil, and that's all it's doing? Whereas Iran is creating the component parts and doing most of the production in Iran, and then exporting all of those products to Russia, and the final assembly is taking place inside of Russia. Well, as a caveat to this channel, as a caveat to my main channel, as what should be a caveat on all YouTube channels that are talking about war, and as a caveat for all the mainstream media sources that you hear that are talking about war, we live in a world where there is a heavy fog. This is a classic fog of war situation, and the fog of war is fun because who really knows the answer to that question? Now, that caveat aside, what I said on the main channel is still likely true. Again, with that modifier, because everything needs it with the fog of war. It is still likely the case that the start of the Israel-Iran war is not going to affect, to a significant degree, the number of drones that are being fired from Russia to Ukraine, again, because probably Russia is domestically manufacturing those drones. I say this for a few reasons, two of which are oddities that would arise if it were the case that Russia were merely assembling them on Russian soil, and one implication that would arise if Iran was manufacturing one key component piece of the devices. Let's start with the oddities of merely assembling them. We know that Russia has a licensing deal with Iran on the production of Shaheds. And maybe production is being used loosely there, but let's think about that for a moment. What exactly is a licensing deal? Typically, a licensing deal is not just taking a puzzle and putting all of its pieces together. A licensing deal would be to be able to produce the puzzle itself. So if it's the case that Russia is only assembling them, then why is it a licensing deal? You're not paying a license to assemble things. You pay a license to actually produce the things. The second oddity of the pure assembly part is that if Russia is just doing the assembly on its soil, then I would want to have a long and serious conversation with the leaders of Russia and Iran about how to efficiently produce military goods. I hinted at this earlier today, but Russia has a labor shortage inside of the country. You have a whole bunch of people fighting a war in Ukraine. You also have a whole bunch of people that have been going away from the traditional productive sectors of the economy and trying to produce military weaponry instead. Well, the assembly part of the Shahed production should be the easy thing to do. It should be literally just putting the puzzle pieces together. And while I would not be able to do that on day one entering a factory, it is something that people should be able to be trained to do, and is not going to be something that you're going to have to rely on Russian expertise to be able to successfully accomplish, especially because Iran was the original producer of these. Meanwhile, you have an Iranian economy that is struggling and could use some sort of boost. So instead of having the Russian government pay lots and lots of rubles that are going to be employing some very expensive individuals to purely do the assembly, it would make a lot more sense for Russia to export and offshore that portion of the production over to Iran if it were feasible in every other way to have those Shaheds be purely made inside of Iran. So the fact that any production at all of Shaheds is happening on Russian soil is indicating that it's worth the expense to Russia to go ahead and do that. Probably because Russia has some advantages there in the production lines and the procedures, which makes it feasible for Russia to do that. It's possible, of course, that I'm wrong about this, but once again, it would be weird if that were the case. The other part is that there are some conversations that perhaps Iran is still making the engines. For whatever reason, Iran is really good at the engine component of the Shahed production, and so that is still happening in Iran, and Iran is taking those engines, shipping them over to Russia. Russia is doing everything else on site, and then is taking the engines that it imports and putting them onto the finalized Shahed drone. Even if that is the case, Ukraine is not going to be getting sudden relief from Israel now bombing Iran. The reason being is that Iran has a surplus of engines, and they do not have a surplus of all the other parts of a Shahed drone. So even if it's the case that you as Iran want to produce as many Shahed drones as you can't just say, all right, well, I'm going to 10x all of my other production of Shahed drones so it can match the engines that I'm producing, or whatever higher number of engines are being produced than the rest of it. I don't know, I was just making up a number. That being the case, Iran is still going to want to export those excess engines to Russia for Russia to finish off their own Shaheds that are missing the engines. And for another, there's some unfortunate consequences or implications of this for what it means for Israeli bombing from the perspective of Ukraine. If you're Israel and you want to stop the production of Shaheds, the thing that you are going to destroy is not the engine factories. Iran has an excess of those engine factories. And for a functional Shahed drone to be constructed, you need one of every component. So instead, what Israel should be prioritizing, again, if this is the case, are the various other parts of the Shahed drone, which, if destroyed, results in a situation where Iran just can't produce any Shaheds at all. Now, maybe at some point, Israel sees one of these engine factories and goes ahead and hits it as a target of opportunity. And to some degree, that would make sense. This is a driver of revenue for the Iranian government, and right now, Israel is in the business of making the Iranian government's life a living nightmare. Denying them some rubles would be a good way to do that. The point is that this is not a single one-step process where Israel starts a war with Iran, and therefore Ukraine gets relief from Russian drones targeting Ukraine. There are a bunch of steps that have to be gone through before Ukraine starts seeing the benefits. Buckle up, because this next one is a long one. There is an idea that is sometimes batted around in situations like this, of a war being ideological, rather than being driven by more typical factors. One or both sides are strongly opposed religiously or politically, and really super hate each other, and simply won't stop fighting until the opponent is gone. Israel and Gaza would seem to be a perfect example, as a large part of Israel's interest in Gaza is its religious heritage. But part of me feels like this is some sort of ruse or misunderstanding, and that these cases of ideological wars are still motivated primarily by more typical factors, resources, for example. How can an ideological motivation in conflict be accounted for in game theory? Or is it actually the case that, in any large conflict, ideological motivation isn't all that influential when compared to other factors, and can be ignored? Well, I have a whole bunch of different answers to this, so let's just go ahead and get started. First bit about this is ideological variance over time. Think about this for a moment. Israel and Iran right now, or alternatively, Israel and Gaza. Whichever one you want to look at, think about the ideological variation over time in either of those conflicts. I don't know about you, but personally, I don't really see much of a change in the ideology of Iran and the ideology of Israel over time. That has stayed relatively constant. Same thing with Israel and Gaza. The ideology there has stayed relatively constant over time. Neither of those parties really likes each other, and that has stayed constant. Now, I keep repeating that word constant for a reason. That's right, I am constantly using the word constant because there is variation over time in the level of conflict observed between Israel and any one of those parties. Let's just focus on Iran right now, given that it is the most prominent at the moment. If you look at the relationship between Israel and Iran, yeah, it's true, they've never really been at full peace. But think about the war versus peace spectrum, where right now we are very far out on that war end, but in previous years we have been closer to the peaceful side of things than we are today. Again, not fully at peace, but definitely not at active war. Sometimes we're in the gray war zone. Sometimes we're in just, hey, they don't really like each other, but they're not trying to kill each other. There's a spectrum there. That's my point. Well, let's be good social scientists for a moment. Earlier, we established that the ideology of both parties has stayed relatively constant over the last 30, 40, however many years you want to go back. That's not changing. However, we just a second ago established that there is variation in the level of conflict between the two of them. And here's the thing that you should know as a good social scientist. You cannot explain variation with a constant. Here, that means you cannot explain variation in the level of conflict with the constant of ideological differences. So even if you think ideology is a big component of this story here, well, you know what? That's fine, but you still can't explain why there's war right now and we didn't see a war, say, a year ago. And really, that is starting to just sound like a substantive disagreement between the two. And you know, if you've watched enough of my videos, that the recipe for war is a substantive disagreement plus a bargaining friction. And what we tend to see having more variation over time is what's going on with those bargaining frictions. So, for example, one reason why perhaps the war is happening today and it wasn't happening 3 months ago is because Israel was under the belief that Iran is much closer to developing a nuclear weapon today than it was before, and having that change in the balance of power that would arise if Israel were to see Iran develop a nuclear weapon, that's just too much. And so Israel chooses to fight. So there's a substantive disagreement that is driving the argument between the two of them, because they're not actually fighting directly over the nuclear weapons. They're fighting over the competing ideology that is separating the two of them on that ideological spectrum. But it's the bargaining friction of a shift in the balance of power that is what's explaining why war is happening right now. And again, if ideological differences are just a substantive disagreement, then what we know is that the parties should be negotiating a resolution instead. Because you could just take the expected outcome of the conflict between the two of them, implement something that is relatively close to that right now without fighting, and therefore save on all the costs of war that you would otherwise be suffering. Now, the next level up on this argumentation might be that there are some ideological issues that are just so intense that you cannot adequately divide the good that is currently being fought over, and as a consequence, you can't negotiate a resolution. Because again, if you're going to bargain away your problems, you need to think about what the expected outcome of the war is, and then divide the good roughly according to that expectation. So if there is some good that we are both fighting over, and there's a 50-50 chance that we're each going to win in the event of a war, we can't maybe split that good in half because the good would lose its value or something like that if we were to do something of the sort. Well, in theory, that explains why a war could happen. But in practice, how good of an explanation is it? One thing to keep in mind here is that usually the way that you hear that something is indivisible is because you have one party that is engaged in coercive negotiations with another party saying, this thing is indivisible. I will never give up a single fraction of the share of the good, because that would be either sacrilegious or against all of my morals or something to that effect. Okay, maybe, but that's starting to sound like a bargaining position. Like you're trying to scare the other side into believing that what you're saying is true so that they are worried about fighting a long conflict that ultimately goes poorly for them, and thus, in turn, they give up the entire good to you, which makes you very happy, even if you were willing at some level to part with some portion of the good. Actually, we are seeing that with Russia right now. Think about all of the claims that the Kremlin is making about those 4 eastern oblasts in Ukraine, that Russia will not compromise 1 inch on any of them. Every single portion of that territory belongs to Russia according to Russian Federation law, and thus the Kremlin will not bargain to 1 single centimeter, not an inch, I almost said an inch because I'm an American, not 1 single centimeter on that. Perhaps a more compelling example might be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the traditional site of Jesus' death. That would seem to be the type of location that would have lots of ideological motivation behind it, especially when you have a whole bunch of different Christian sects that might all want to lay claim to that site as being one of the most important and one of the most holy sites in all of Christianity, be it your sect or the other sects. And goodness, that's the type of thing that people have strong opinions on. Moreover, it seems like the type of thing that you cannot divide, and yet they found a way. If you look at a schematic of the church, one sect controls one part of the church, a second sect controls a second part of the church, a third sect controls a third part of the church, and so forth. And because having control over the keys to the church is probably a pretty important thing if you care a lot about this, they actually agreed that not a single one of them should have the keys to the church, and instead it's been entrusted for centuries to a Muslim family. Meanwhile, the lines on maps subtly incorporate ideology implicitly in the way that they are drawn. Remember that the white line here represents the expected outcome of the war. The space between the white and the red line represents how much Russia pays in terms of costs, converted to square kilometers of territory. And analogously, the space between the white and the yellow lines represents how Ukraine internalizes those costs of war, again converted to square kilometers of territory. Well, think about what I just said there. We're converting loss of life, among other things, into whatever it is that we're fighting over. Here it's square kilometers of territory, but you could think about this as just being a pure ideological spectrum. The more ideologically intense you are about the conflict, about the issue at stake, the more willing you are to pay costs to win that conflict. So the way that gets represented in these lines on maps is that the larger the ideological difference between the two parties, the lower they internalize the costs of war. So greater ideology means that we draw those red and yellow lines closer to the expected outcome of the war. The last thing I want to highlight is this article, Ethnic War as a Commitment Problem by James Fearon. You may be familiar with that name because James Fearon is the person that originated crisis bargaining theory in the way that I have taught all of you it. Now, this is not the main paper that introduced this field. That paper is called Rationalist Explanations for War. But it is a paper in the broader spectrum that Fearon was working on along these types of research questions. It is also, incidentally, the first paper that I read in that series, and it was very influential to me because reading this, lots of things clicked for me, light bulbs went off, and this is what got me interested in studying this. And now here we are, almost 2 decades later, and I'm talking to maybe 100,000 people about this on a secondary channel. So, Ethan, if you're listening to this, thank you for assigning me this paper. It was literally life-changing in many ways. But it's also just a very good read. I would recommend you go ahead and Google search this, go ahead and take a look at this. There's a couple of interesting things to point out here. One is that in the article, he's talking about how there is a public perception at the time about civil wars that are happening in the post-Soviet sphere states in Eastern Europe. And indeed, it was fashionable in the moment to talk about ideology and ancient hatreds as what was causing these conflicts. But he also points out that those sorts of things were relatively constant over time. And actually, if you look at the chronology of ideological extremism, what started to happen is that as the types of commitment problems and shifting power issues that we've been talking about a lot on the main channel, as those things were starting to come into focus, you started seeing exacerbation of ideological issues. In other words, it is the bargaining friction that is priming the ideological conflict, and not vice versa. One compelling example he has of this with ethnic wars, it is ethnic war as a commitment problem, you had intermarriage rates increasing over time between the two groups, and then suddenly there is a commitment problem, a bargaining problem on the horizon, and then that is when things all start to turn south. So, like I said, it's an excellent paper, a life-changing paper for me. About 9 years after I first read it, I would eventually become James Fearon's postdoc for a year. About 6 years after that, I'm now teaching this sort of stuff to a whole bunch of you. All of that's great. It might be worth an afternoon of yours to just go ahead and read through it too. As for some lines on careers, at what number of subs are you going to transition to the comfort of being a full-time YouTuber? Couple of points there. One, this commonly comes up with people who are either new to the business of YouTube or just are never involved in the business of YouTube, which is probably for the best. But subscriptions have very little impact on the amount of revenue that someone brings in. It's a vanity number that eventually gives them plaques, which is cool, and I want my plaques. I want to get to 1 million subscribers on the main channel eventually, I suppose. All of that's cool, but none of that actually directly brings in revenue. It's much better to have a channel that gets 5 million views per month and has 100,000 subscribers than to have a channel that has 5 million subscribers and only 100,000 views per month. But even if I do get up to a ridiculous number of views, and that ridiculous number is consistent, and YouTube is absolutely anything other than consistent, but even if that were the case, I'm a tenured professor. I am not giving up that job anytime soon. And that's a good place to stop us for today, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.